Okay, squad, welcome back to the ODR in the front yard. And to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the finale of season 1 of Hell's Kitchen, I bring to you my first ever review on the ODR channel, that being a review of Hell's Kitchen season 1, the very first season of Hell's Kitchen, which I think is okay. It definitely has some growing pains, which is to be expected with any TV show. But with this season of Hell's Kitchen, it's definitely more noticeable as, again, it was the very first season of Hell's Kitchen. And as a matter of fact, half of the people on this cast weren't even professional chefs. Many of them didn't even have much kitchen experience at all. You only had a couple people in the cast that actually had some sort of experience, such as Chris, who was an executive chef, Dewberry, who was a pastry chef, etc. And speaking of the cast wasn't really a standout cast, again, not just in terms of talent, but also in terms of their personalities as well. Some of them just kind of sucked, whereas others tended to blend into the background very easily, which I will cover later in the review. But without further ado, let's get started with that review. As a little bit of a side note, I did take notes on the season as I watched it, where I would write down information that I thought was important to the season as a whole and also could have impacted parts of the season that totaled out to about 24 pages. So without further ado, let's get started with the review of Hell's Kitchen Season 1. To start off, we have episode 1, named just Day 1, which I think is a relatively decent premiere. It does have the whole spiel of the contestants introducing each other. Then they meet the sous chefs, Scott and Marianne this season, and JP, Jean-Philippe, before they're asked to produce their signature dishes, where they have 45 minutes to do so before the time runs out. Elsie accidentally cut herself during the making of the signature dish, but she managed to recover and produce her dish in time. The order the dishes were presented was random, with Chef Ramsay lifting the lid off of the dishes before calling the contestants up to explain their signature dish, and then Ramsay would taste it. The order that the contestants went in this episode was Andrew, Mary Ellen, Wendy, Jimmy, Ralph, Elsie, Dewberry, Chris, Jeff, Jessica, Michael, and Carol Ann. First up, we have Andrew's signature dish, which he called Andrew's Absolute Penne, which let's just say it was really bad, to the point where Ramsay spit it out and he called it absolute dog shit. Then we have Mary Ellen's endive salad, which Chef Ramsay didn't even taste because he said it looked boring. Then we have Wendy's fried rice, which he said was unimpressive. At this point, I was pretty convinced that the talent of the season was going to be pretty bad, but it makes sense because this is the first season of Hell's Kitchen, and as I alluded to earlier, half of the cast this season wasn't even professional chefs, or had much kitchen experience at all for that matter. Up next was someone who actually did have kitchen experience in Ralph, who brought up a seared tuna, but Chef Ramsay didn't like it, asking him, "You're number one with that shit?" But then we finally get into our first somewhat decent signature dish, coming from Elsie with her turkey tacos, which Chef Ramsay said presentation-wise, it sucked, but in terms of taste, it was not bad. But then we get into some of the more bad signature dishes, with Dewberry's baked spaghetti, which Gordon Ramsay referred to as children's food. And then there's the executive chef Chris, who put salmon on a plank, but it was raw. To the point where Chef Ramsay even called him a plank, meaning idiot. Next to go was Jeff with the steak and mushroom dish, which Ramsay said had a nice sauce, but the mushrooms were salty and the steak was also overcooked, to the point where he gave it a 1 out of 10. Up next was Jessica with their soft shell crabs, which had an aioli to it, but when Ramsay tasted it, he said it was too spicy and was burning his mouth off. The next to the last person to go was Michael with the scallops, which Chef Ramsay even had him taste himself. Michael said it wasn't bad, but Chef Ramsay told him that he had a palate like a cow's backside and that it was disgusting. Finally, we have Carol Ann, who didn't have much kitchen experience and made a simple chicken parmesan. But, according to Ramsay, the presentation was nice and it also tasted very nice, to the point where he actually used her as an example for the other chefs, as she didn't have much kitchen experience and could still produce something like that. And out of all the signature dishes, as I mentioned earlier, all of them were poor except for Elsie's, which he thought was decent, and Carol Ann's, which we thought was good. Then the contestants are divided into the red team and blue team that we know, but this season was not a battle of the sexes. On the red team, you had Jimmy, Elsie, Dewberry, Chris, Caroline, and Jeff. And on the blue team, you had Andrew, Mary Ellen, Jessica, Wendy, Ralph, and Michael. After going back down to the kitchen for dinner service, Chef Ramsay announces that Hell's Kitchen will be open that night, and one of the teams will lose and one of their members will be going home. As a result, the chefs have to prepare for dinner service, consisting of 5 starters, 5 entrees, and 5 desserts. And Gordon Ramsay himself says, and I quote, "You need bloody good service to complement the food, and you need bloody good food to complement the service." During this service, however, Chef Ramsay also designates waiters for each team, choosing Ralph from the blue team and Jeff from the red team, which Jeff seems to be okay with the idea of being a waiter, but Ralph not so much. Dinner service then begins, and the blue team doesn't immediately respond to Chef Ramsay, immediately having trouble with communications, so he has to repeat the ticket again, and only then does the blue team respond to Chef Ramsay. In the dining room, Jeff struggles to be a waiter, with JP, of all people, having to help them. The first mistake of the service comes from Elsie, who finishes a risotto, but Gordon Ramsay tells her that the risotto is crap and has to start it again. Trouble begins to brew an hour into service as no one has been served, not even appetizers. This leads to one of the tables starting to get restless, and visibly so. Michael also runs out of lobster pasta to the point where he has to go retrieve more from the storage room. Ralph begins to try to keep customers at bay while they wait for their food, but a group of ladies that he's talking with gets fed up, not because of Ralph, but because of the wait. So they go up to Gordon Ramsay at the hot plate to try to see if he can do anything about it, but he just ignores them. 20 minutes later, the red team begins to put out appetizers and more, but Chris ruins the momentum by overcooking a salmon, resulting in the whole table having to be redone. And this wasn't the first time Chris had troubles with salmon either, considering his raw salmon for his signature dish on a plank. Jimmy also messes up during this time by presenting a dish which Gordon Ramsay calls a dog's dinner. About halfway through service, both teams have served pretty much all of their appetizers but haven't got any entrees out. Andrew also begins to act like a douchebag in this service, calling out Gordon Ramsay and saying in a confessional, "You want to pick on me? Pick on me. I don't give an F." Elsie comes back up with the risotto that she messed up on initially, but this time, instead of it being bad, it's much more delicious. However, we later hear from the narrator that Jimmy has been having trouble all night, and to make matters worse, he burns his hand in the middle of service. Elsie also notes how Carol Ann hasn't been doing anything, so Gordon Ramsay tries to motivate her by switching sections to the point where she just says, "all right." In the dining room, Jeff is still trying to be the best waiter he can and failing miserably. The same table that tried to get Ramsay's attention earlier goes back up, but Chef Ramsay has JP escort them, quote, back to plastic surgery, resulting in them walking out. And despite entrees beginning to fly out of both kitchens, it's too late. Tables are walking out, and as a result, the kitchen shuts down. Before shutdown, however, Chef Ramsay notes that Dewberry has just been kind of sitting there for the past hour or so, like a big overgrown Muppet. Once he rounds up the teams for the post-mortem, he announces that he's referring to the customer comment cards for this service. The customer comment cards note that Jeff was a very poor waiter, but that Ralph's performance, on the other hand, was outstanding. Andrew was also noted for being able to get out 4 desserts, but the customers did not like those desserts. And while the red team are named as losers, Gordon Ramsay also said that the blue team did not win at the same time. From the red team, he singled out Elsie for being the best performer that night, before naming her the best of the worst and telling her to come up with 2 nominees for elimination. Once the teams are dismissed back to the dorms, Jimmy decides not to plead his case to Elsie, seeming to realize that he messed up the most that night, and in my opinion, he should have been nominated for this. Elsie does, however, converse with Dewberry, assuring him that he is not going anywhere, before the teams meet back in the kitchen with the blue team off to the side and the red team facing Ramsay in the middle of the dining room. After Elsie was tasked with giving her 2 nominees to Chef Ramsay, she named Carol Ann due to her inexperience, and also named Dewberry, despite telling him that he wasn't going anywhere, due to what she perceived as a lack of energy and overall interest. interest. Despite Chef Ramsay calling the two nominees forward, he did also single out Jimmy and Jeff by letting them know that they had dodged a bullet that night, before having the two nominees plead their cases. Carol Ann said that you shouldn't underestimate someone with a lack of experience, and Dewberry pointed to his base knowledge, providing him with a greater advantage, and also saying that it was the greatest thing he had to offer. Between the two nominees, Chef Ramsay decided to make Carol Ann the first boot of the season, and also the first boot in Hell's Kitchen history, mainly for turning her back on the team and not showing any interest in the team, to where Carol Ann says she's very angry and how seeing the opportunity disappear was very disappointing. Before the episode ends, Dewberry begins to plot revenge against Elsie for essentially putting him up there despite her telling him that he was safe, with Chef Ramsay saying that some can handle it and some cannot, and he's not interested in those people. Now, I personally would not have nominated Carol Ann or Dewberry that night. I actually would have nominated Jimmy and Jeff, as they were the weakest performers that night, in my opinion. But now we can finally talk about the first boot of the season in Carol Ann, who wasn't the most interesting character in the world, but I do think it was rather unfortunate that she was the first boot, as I think she had a lot of potential in her, and I think the reason she got eliminated was kind of odd. It did make a little bit of sense between her and Dewberry, but I think she was less bad than Dewberry that night, even though, again, Dewberry was not the worst in the kitchen either. According to what we saw, that was Jimmy with all the mistakes that he made. So I do think Carol Ann got very unfortunate to be the first boot here, but she wasn't the most interesting TV in the world either. Up next, we have episode 2, which is titled Day 2, because that's the theme for the season. But it starts off with a recap, as episodes usually do, and then we get into Dewberry seeking some alone time, only for Elsie to be in the same room as him, to where they seemingly make up from last night's events. But Dewberry says, "It's kind of difficult for me to hold a grudge, but if it were me picked, it would be payback time." Later that night on the red team, Michael tells Jeff that he lucked out that night, and Jeff says that Gordon Ramsay is trying to look for improvement. Then the sous chefs wake up the chefs the following morning by banging pots and pans, and everyone goes down to the kitchen immediately, except for Chris, who takes a moment to brush his teeth and doesn't come down until 10 minutes later. And while Chef Ramsay praises the blue team for arriving on time, he calls Chris a lazy shit. Then Chef Ramsay lifts off a dome, revealing pilots of squid for the reward challenge, where they will have 10 minutes to clean as much squid as they can. He chooses Michael to sit out of the challenge instead of having one of the members volunteer, in order to even out the playing field. After 10 minutes, time runs out and the red team goes first. Everyone cleans one squid except for Dewberry, who cleans 2. Then we move on to the blue team, where the results are very lopsided. Both Ralph and Mary Ellen clean 2 squids, while Jessica cleans 1 squid, while Wendy and Andrew clean none, leading to the blue team losing and the red team winning. For the reward, that evening, the red team gets to eat dinner with Chef Ramsay, while the blue team has to prepare squid. Before dinner service, Chef Ramsay also trains the chefs on some additional cooking techniques that they'll need for that night. But later that night, Jeff is in pain, and we later learn that it's due to kidney stones, with Jessica thinking that he's a hypochondriac, and when she sees him in pain, she kind of lets him be and is like, whatever, which, not a nice thing to do. The next day, the chefs are preparing for dinner service, with Dewberry preparing Chef Ramsay a spaghetti dish, which he says is very nice, and he wants all of his dishes like that the entire night. On the blue team, however, Wendy has trouble getting organized, and in addition to that, since they lost the reward challenge, they'll have to cook with no air conditioning. Then Hell's Kitchen opens. Immediately after it does, appetizer orders come flying into the kitchen. Wendy still has problems getting things together, but when Mary Ellen sends her Caesar salad to the pass, there are no problems. And Dewberry also gets a spaghetti dish that he sent up to Chef Ramsay out for another customer, and they describe it as amazing. But then Wendy starts to have further problems when she finally gets her risotto to the pass, and the rice is crunchy. She ends up delegating the task to Ralph, and thanks to him, he gets it out with no problems. An hour into dinner service, the red team has served all their appetizers and starts on entrees, but then Jeff struggles with garnish, likely due to the pain that he was having. Elsie, however, says, "I just didn't have time to feel sorry for him." 30 minutes later, despite the heat being intense, the blue team catches up to the red team, and Chris also jumps in to help Elsie on the red team. assisting her in cooking the fish. Back on the blue team, there's issues with communication on the meat station between Andrew and Mary Ellen, with Mary Ellen also setting up a Wellington which was undercooked. On the red team, Dewberry brings up Wellington to the pass along with lamb, which is beautiful, but the Wellington itself is overcooked, and he also has a fire form in his pan. 30 minutes later, complaints start to come in about the lack of service in the dining room. When Chef Ramsay calls out 2 cod and 2 Wellington for the red team, Dewberry says 12 minutes, seeming to be confused, and he even walks off his station and tries to quit until the red team has to kind of call him out and say, hey, don't do that, which leads to him walking back into the kitchen, mainly due to the expression that he saw in Elsie's face. Back in the blue kitchen, entrees are starting to fly out of the kitchen, but Andrew tries to play politics with sous chef Scott, despite him not agreeing with it per se. And this next part is ridiculous. An hour later, a customer even brings a pizza into the restaurant, fed up with the lack of service that they've got, which results in JP telling them that they have to leave. And after this happens, Gordon Ramsay once again shuts down the kitchen. When he brings the teams together for the post-mortem, he tells the blue team that their courses were not good, and then the red team got 3/4 of their appetizers out, but less than half of their main courses, leading to them losing again. In a reversal of fortune from the previous day, Gordon Ramsay praises Chris for his communication and names him the best of the worst, telling him to nominate 2 of his team members for elimination. Jeff ends up pleading his case to Chris, saying that he was doing well until he was in pain, and Dewberry said, if I don't go tonight, I'll have to earn the respect of my team back, and I don't know if that's going to be possible. When the red team meets Gordon Ramsay in the dining room, Chris names Dewberry and Jeff as his nominees for lack of control over their emotions and also for not being the greatest team players in the world, and Gordon Ramsay tells Chris that's the right choice and that he agrees 110%. When asked why they should say, Dewberry did not excuse his behavior but also said that he had some decent work that night, alluding to his spaghetti dish, while Jeff said that he was a team player but Chef Ramsay called him crap. Ultimately, Dewberry was eliminated, which wasn't really a surprise considering as soon as he walked off the line I knew his fate was sealed, and Dewberry didn't justify it in his end statement, with Chef Ramsay even saying that he's looking for someone who can inspire individuals, stand as a great leader, and more, but Dewberry just wasn't that kind of guy. But now let's talk about Dewberry, who I enjoyed as a character on this season, but he is one of the weaker chefs of the season. A lot of people say he's the worst chef of the season, and I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but he is definitely one of the worst, and I hate to say it, but it is true. I do like that he came back for the finale, which really was only due to Chris and Mary Ellen not showing up, but he didn't have the greatest performance in the finale. He did come back from seemingly almost passing out, so I do admire his determination, but in general, I don't think he's someone who's cut out for Hell's Kitchen due to how stressful it is, so unfortunately, he's not one of the greatest chefs. I do like him as a character, though. Up next, we have episode 3, Day 3, which I think is one of the better episodes of the season due to everything that happens in this episode. It starts off with Dewberry being missed by both teams, although they do acknowledge that it is probably for the best that he left due to him not being able to take the stress of Hell's Kitchen as much as the others could. Jeff is still in pain from his kidney stones, and he actually passes a kidney stone that was causing him pain and decides to show it off to some of the other chefs, including Jessica. The next morning, when the chefs go down to the kitchen, Chef Ramsay notices a deficit on the red team of 6-4, so he evens up the teams by sending Michael from the blue team over to the red team, before introducing the reward challenge, which is to produce a 5-course meal for him. The chefs are driven to the grocery store in a London-style double-decker bus, which I thought was a nice touch, before arriving at the grocery store and having a limit of $100 to spend in 10 minutes. So the teams move quickly, but Andrew gets annoyed with Ralph as he takes charge on the blue team. While they're coordinated, however, the red team is a little more discombobulated, with Jeff going off by himself and annoying all of his team members, especially Elsie, who says that he makes the hair stand up on the back of her head. The red team gets all their ingredients with 1 minute left, while the blue team gets their last ingredient in the nick of time by Ralph literally throwing the ingredient into the cart. They also meet the $100 limit, so they're able to take their ingredients back to the kitchen. Ralph continues to take the leadership role on the blue team, much to Andrew's chagrin, who calls him a control freak. After an hour of cooking, they present their dishes to Chef Ramsay. In round 1, the cold starters are presented, with Jessica presenting a grilled pineapple with potatoes and Elsie presenting a simple salad. The simple salad is nice, but the pineapple and potatoes were deemed to be tasteless. Next came the hot appetizer round, with Ralph presenting a roasted corn chowder, which was deemed to be very nice. Then Jeff presented a white onion soup puree, which the red team thought was going to be awful, but Chef Ramsay said it was delicious, the one good thing Jeff did in their eyes. For the fish round, Wendy presented a roasted salmon with bok choy, which Chef Ramsay said was not bad, and Chris presented a poached sole with cauliflower and scallions, but for Chef Ramsay, it did absolutely nothing. In the meat round, Andrew presented a grilled ribeye with an oxtail mushroom sauce and white peaches, but according to Chef Ramsay, it doesn't work. Which, why would you put peaches on a steak? And then Michael presented a grilled pork ass, which Chef Ramsay thought was delicious. The final round was the dessert round, with Mary Ellen presenting a creme brulee trio, which Chef Ramsay said was delicious, and Jimmy presented a vanilla poached pear, which was dull. As a result, the teams tied 3-3, with Chef Ramsay having to choose a winning team, and he chose the red team, who was rewarded with a trip to a pub, or bar in America, with Chef Ramsay. The blue team's punishment is to clean the dorms, in addition to having to prep for that night's service, with them being unhappy over their loss, even pissed in some cases. When the chefs go down to the kitchen to prep the following day, Jeff accidentally burns Elsie's hand by leaving a baking sheet on a hot pan, leading to what is essentially an emergency meeting to discuss Jeff's actions, with Elsie even having to go to the bedroom to pull Jeff out to discuss him at the meeting. But during the meeting, he gets into an argument with Chris and ends up walking away, much to Elsie's chagrin because she doesn't want the team to fall apart. And during prep, Jeff continues to struggle. Just before dinner service starts, Chef Ramsay announced that some top food critics will be dining at Hell's Kitchen that night for both teams and will be rating the food, which could have an impact on his decision later that night. As dinner service begins, Jeff already gets off to a rough start with the lobster spaghetti, with one of the spaghetti dishes having all the lobster and the other having none. So Michael has to jump in and help him, with Jeff quite literally yelling that he was never on a line before, despite working on a line the previous night with his team. And then we get the iconic moment of Wendy saying that she thought cold water was supposed to boil faster than hot water, much to Ramsay's confusion. Both teams begin serving appetizers to the critics, with the red team's lobster spaghetti being rated highly but not the crab risotto, while the blue team's appetizers are both rated very poorly. Even the customers don't like the blue team's appetizers, and one of them even threw up, leaving the restaurant as a result. And Andrew gets into another argument with Chef Ramsay over the vomiting scandal. On the red team, Jeff tells Chef Ramsay that he needs 5 minutes for a lamb and bass, but Chef Ramsay wants 4 minutes, and Jeff yells at him again. Ralph once again takes charge of the blue team, being the leader, and with his help, the blue team begins to get main courses out. On the red team, Jeff once again argues with Chef Ramsay, and he begins to essentially fall apart until he decides he's not a quitter and he's going to finish out the service. But Chef Ramsay tells him that he's not an effing cook, and Jeff calls him an asshole. But it does not go unnoticed, with sous chef Marianne overhearing him and telling him to say it louder multiple times, which he does, calling Chef Ramsay an asshole once again, and after being caught out by the team, he walks off on the spot, quitting the game. Before I finish my summary and review of Day 3, I would like to talk about Jeff, who I did feel sorry for initially, but what he did in Episode 3 made me stop feeling sorry for him, because he came off as a complete douche and had the audacity to yell at Chef Ramsay, which is a big no-no. But the biggest detractor for me was that he gave up because Chef Ramsay was yelling at him and he couldn't handle it. Imagine if more people threw in the towel because of Chef Ramsay yelling at them, which did happen a couple of times, but it wasn't very common in the series, and still isn't. But Jeff was the catalyst for that, and the catalyst for a few quitters, so I have to knock him for that. And I also have to knock him for being an unlikable personality, especially in his boot episode. Returning to the episode, we see the fallout from Jeff's quit, with Ramsay informing the red team that Jeff will not be returning due to him walking out, and this leads to them being very annoyed with him, with Jimmy saying that Jeff lost his respect and Elsie could vote him off twice if she wanted to. As dinner service progresses, the blue team prepares lamb for the critics and gets it sent out, with one of them being perfect but the other one being completely overcooked. As the red team proceeds through dinner service without Jeff, they also begin to put out entrees, including lamb, which this time is well received by both critics. As Gordon Ramsay makes his way back to the blue team, he chastises Wendy for not delivering on her orders and always having something to say, and customers begin to walk out for the third time in a row, leading to the kitchen shutting down once again. During the post-mortem, Chef Ramsay announces his decision based on the critics' reviews of the dishes, with the blue team this time being named as the losers of the service. He also names Ralph as the best of the worst for his leadership and is instructed to come up with 2 nominees for elimination. Later that night, once they meet up again, Ralph nominates Wendy due to her collapse on the meat station and also nominates Andrew for his constant arguments with Chef Ramsay. The two are then called forward, with Wendy mentioning that she had a bad performance, and that was about it. Andrew, however, says that he knew him and Chef Ramsay had an argument, with Chef Ramsay cutting him off mid-plea and having him restart the entire plea from scratch. Despite this, he saves Andrew and eliminates Wendy for her complete collapse on the meat station, with her admitting that nothing went right that night. A lot of stuff happened this episode, with Andrew's arguments, the iconic line of cold water and hot water, Jeff quitting the game. There was a lot to like this episode, or if it wasn't to like, it was definitely iconic. So now let's finally talk about Wendy, who, besides having the iconic line of "I thought cold water was supposed to boil faster than hot water," she didn't really offer much to the season. She wasn't much of a character, but she did seem a little clueless in the kitchen and didn't really seem to put out that many good dishes during her stay, so I do feel she is one of the weaker chefs of the season alongside Dewberry, but she did give us that iconic line, and that's very good. Up next, we have episode 4, which I did not think was that good of an episode. It starts off with Jessica lamenting Wendy's elimination along with Ralph, who both said that Wendy was very kind. On the red team, however, there's a different sentiment as they celebrate the fact that Jeff is no longer with them. Seeking to repair things from last night, Ralph has a one-on-one with Andrew trying to clear the air between them after Andrew was put on the block. The next morning, the sous chefs once again wake the teams up, this time with air horns instead of pots and pans. Then they prep, and Chef Ramsay has them go into the dining room for the reward challenge, with JP showing them how to set up a table, and the reward challenge is to recreate setting up the table. They take 5 minutes to do so before Chef Ramsay critiques the tables, with the red team having 4 mistakes while the blue team only had 1, and thus the blue team is named as the winning team. For the reward, they don't even leave Hell's Kitchen either, they just get a spa day in the dorms, while the red team has to polish every single glass for dinner service and all of the silverware as well. And during the punishment, Jimmy has another one of his infamous moments where he breaks multiple glasses during the punishment. Once the teams finally retire for the night, they go outside and look up into the night sky and see Chef Ramsay's face with Hell's Kitchen on a billboard. During prep the following day, Chef Ramsay adds frog legs and pigeons to the main menu, and preparing them turns out to be quite nasty for all the chefs involved, especially Elsie. And Chef Ramsay decides to guarantee a winning team that night by saying whoever completes service first will be safe from elimination, while the other team will have to nominate 2 chefs. But in addition to prepping, the red team also has to set up all the tables in the dining room, and they get this done with only 5 minutes left before dinner service. Sous Chef Scott also notes that Mary Ellen's station is set up beautifully before dinner service starts. Ralph, however, is still weary of Andrew, so he comes up with a cheat sheet of sorts for him, and then that night's dinner service actually begins. As dinner service begins, Mary Ellen sends appetizers up to the pass, which Chef Ramsay says are nice. On the red team, Elsie begins to have communication issues, which actually leads to her almost breaking down, but she begins to recover. The meat station gets off to a pretty hot start on the blue team, with Ralph having Jessica bring a Wellington up to the pass, which is perfectly cooked, but then there are issues with garnish, with Andrew sending up the incorrect garnish. Despite this, however, the blue team rebounds. The red team also begins to have issues with garnish, as Jimmy sends up garnish that is stone cold. The blue team struggles continue, with Andrew struggling even harder with communication, forgetting the endive, resulting in the entire table needing to be redone, and he gets called out by Chef Ramsay for it, but this time he actually keeps his mouth shut and decides not to pick an argument. Elsie keeps trying to keep a hold of her emotions while Jessica keeps a hold of the meat station on the blue team, but then Mary Ellen falters with mushy risotto on the blue team, despite there being only 5 tickets left, and the red team begins to catch up. Mary Ellen brings her risotto back up to the pass, but this time, instead of it being mushy, she forgot the tuna, and so she has to redo it again. By this time, the red team reaches their final ticket, and they get it out with no issues, with Jimmy and Elsie noting in confessionals how proud they were to finish service. As for the blue team, their kitchen gets shut down, with Mary Ellen and Andrew pinning the blame on each other in their own confessionals. During the post-mortem, instead of naming Ralph the best of the worst on the blue team, he names Jessica as the best of the worst on the blue team and instructs her to nominate 2 chefs for elimination. This worries Ralph, even though he says his performance didn't merit his elimination, and Andrew thinks he's screwed due to all the issues he had that night. When Jessica comes back down, she does nominate Andrew for his issues that night, but also decides to nominate Mary Ellen due to her issues with the risotto, leading to them stepping forward and giving their pleas to Chef Ramsay. Andrew says that this time he was a learning machine and that he kept his mouth shut and didn't pick a fight with Chef Ramsay, whereas Mary Ellen said she had a good performance on starters until she let the team down with those risottos that she messed up, including mushy risotto and the one that didn't have tuna in it. In the first true surprising elimination of the season, Chef Ramsay decided to eliminate Mary Ellen over Andrew in a decision that I think was due to Andrew being better TV than Mary Ellen, with Chef Ramsay also noting that she wasn't very consistent either. Mary Ellen noted in her final statement that she thought Chef Ramsay's decision was the wrong one, and I agree. I don't think Mary Ellen was the worst performer of that night. It was definitely Andrew with all his struggles. And let's talk more about Mary Ellen as a character. Which, was she much of one? No, absolutely not. Mary Ellen didn't really add much to the season. She did kind of feel like the archetype of a chef that just put their head down and cooked, but didn't really add much to the show at the same time, so she was definitely a more forgettable presence on the cast, but I do think she was one of the more decent chefs of the cast, especially compared to some of the previous chefs that we've gone over, and even some of the ones we will go over in a second. Up next, we have episode 5, which I believe is a very interesting episode and really was the beginning of strategy for one of the competitors in particular. The episode starts off with Jessica once again upset over the elimination choice that Chef Ramsay made because he decided to eliminate Mary Ellen over Andrew. And she was sure that Andrew was going, but nope, he didn't. She agrees with Ralph that Andrew needs to go soon, but not to the point where they throw dinner service, absolutely not. The next morning, when the chefs come down, both teams are asked to name their strongest and weakest links. Specifically, Chef Ramsay asked Ralph from the blue team and Chris from the red team. Both of them say that they are the strongest links of their team, and when asked to name the weakest link, Ralph pinpoints Andrew, where Chris pinpoints Jimmy. And this is a sentiment that I agreed with. I do think both of them were the weakest links on their team. As for the strongest link, I do think Ralph was the strongest on the blue team, but Chris being the strongest on the red team was a little bit questionable in my eyes. Chef Ramsay then leads the chefs into the kitchen, teaching them how to make pasta by hand before putting some of it on Chris, and Chef Ramsay even has him sit out of the challenge in order to make the teams more even. They have 20 minutes to make the pasta, with the red team putting all their pasta on Jimmy and the blue team putting their pasta on Andrew. Once time runs out, the blue team goes first, and most of their pasta is good, but they do have a batch that is crinkly. In the end, they get a total of 2.41 pounds, and then it's the red team's turn, who also has a major clump that gets thrown out, but they finish with 2.45 pounds, and despite protests from the blue team, they win and they get to leave Hell's Kitchen for the day, getting to ride on a gondola and eat Italian cuisine, whereas the blue team has to make pasta by hand just as Chef Ramsay had taught them earlier in the day. The 3 blue team members, especially Ralph, complain about their loss to the point where they throw things around. And Jessica even says that Michael is the most manipulative of the group and saying that he'd even kill to win his restaurant. Later that night, we get a little bit of proof of this, but more so the former statement, with Michael making a plan with Chris to go to the end together where they can battle it out. And then he goes outside for a conversation with himself? Before promising Chef Ramsay that he will win for him. Finally, dinner service arrives, and as the reward challenge had alluded to an extent, that night they will be having a pasta menu, but the teams will be cooking separately, with one team cooking while the other team serves the customers. The red team won the challenge, and they got to choose whether they cooked or served first, and they decided to cook first as dinner service begins. Jimmy starts to send out starters as dinner service begins, but he immediately gets called out for having dirty plates and dirty bowls, with Gordon Ramsay getting very visibly upset over it. And Gordon Ramsay also gets upset when Chris says "we chef," which in my opinion is stupid. Although nothing seems to happen initially after this, they do pick up the pace with 30 minutes left into dinner service, but Michael decides to work on desserts and essentially let his team fend for themselves, but with problems developing toward the end, it goes poorly, and once they hit 2 hours, Chef Ramsay isn't happy because entrees weren't fast enough. After taking an hour off, the blue team takes over in the kitchen, and it's at this point where Michael develops his strategy for the rest of the night, and possibly even for the elimination as well, as he first plots a takedown of the blue team by having the customers order a lot of lasagna, essentially highly recommending them to order the lasagna, which many of them do, with the main reason being that it's a pain in the ass to make and he wants to shove it down their throats as much as they can to essentially tire them out. And then Michael goes through with the plan, but this does not go unnoticed by the blue team members, especially Jessica, who noted that it was clear that they tried to sabotage them. However, it does seem to work to an extent because Ralph begins to struggle with the lasagna. Back in the dining room, Jimmy gets called out by some of the customers for being sweaty and even gets into a little bit of an altercation with JP, who tells him to stop touching his face because he's so damn sweaty. Jimmy further struggles in the dining room with Tortellini Gate as he sends Tortellini to the wrong table. Andrew continues to struggle with communication and also cooking some of the food as well, with one of his plates and another one of Jessica's plates getting called out for looking like a dog's dinner, which isn't the first time Gordon Ramsay used that insult. But as with the red team, Gordon Ramsay was not happy and he shut down the service after 2 hours. During the post-mortem, Chef Ramsay talked to the teams about their performances that night, as while the red team served more customers than the blue team had better service and better food, making them the winners and the red team the losers. He also chose Michael for the best of the worst and told him to nominate 2 chefs for elimination. Both Elsie and Jimmy seem to think that their fates are sealed that night, with Chris even pushing them to be nominated because they were both crap on the floor. But for Michael, the decision was not difficult. When they reconvene, he does nominate Elsie for being flustered during service, but he also nominates Chris despite the agreement they had, citing Jimmy was apparently doing well and busting his ass that night, and also Chris's statement that he was the strongest link being to his detriment. Which, while I do get where Michael was coming from a strategic perspective, from a cooking perspective, this just did not make sense, because the only real bad thing Chris did that night was say "we chef," which isn't even that bad. Jimmy was clearly the worst performer that night, not just in the kitchen, but in the dining room as well, when he couldn't stop sweating. Despite this, Chef Ramsay honors Michael's wishes and calls Elsie and Chris forward. During their pleas, Elsie said that she learned a lot during her time in Hell's Kitchen and hasn't stopped working, while Chris says his work ethic speaks for him and it will pay off in the long run. In another surprising elimination, Chef Ramsay decides to eliminate Chris, and this included a message for everyone else, which was no matter how good they think they were, if they self-promoted and didn't deliver the goods, that was what annoyed him the most. And like I said, strategically, this move was insane, because with one swift move, Michael got rid of who he saw as his closest competition, despite the agreement he had just made with Chris the night before. Now let's talk about Chris, who was a little bit of a character this season. He did come off as a little bit cocky, but I do think he was one of the better chefs of the season, and his claim that he was the strongest link in the red team had some merit to it, but I do think as time went on, he began to get outshined by Michael in that regard, so like I said, it did have some merit to it, but it wasn't entirely justified. Regardless, he was still one of the better chefs in the red team. He was an executive chef after all, so he brought his skills to the table and kind of just let them speak for themselves, even though, again, he was a little cocky about it. Up next, we have episode 6, which is another interesting episode, mainly due to the antics that happen on the blue team and also their consequences, I guess you could say. We begin the episode with Elsie relieved to still be in the competition, but completely shocked about the elimination, as she was expecting herself to go and not Chris. And she's not the only one to have problems with Chris's elimination. Ralph also has problems with it because he feels like it sent a message to him in particular, but he understands it loud and clear. Then it's time for the blind taste test challenge, which will become a future staple in Hell's Kitchen seasons to follow. In round 1, Andrew and Jimmy face off, with Andrew identifying the chicken, but not Jimmy, then missing the next 2 items before Jimmy identifies a radish, with Andrew missing it. At the end of round 1, the score is 1-1 when Elsie and Jessica face off, with neither being able to identify the ox tongue, but Elsie gets all 3 ingredients to follow, while Jessica gets none of them, going 0 for 4. This puts the score at 4-1 when Ralph and Michael, arguably the greatest chefs on the show at that point, face off in the final round. Neither of them can identify the veal sweetbread, and Ralph misses the spinach leaf, thus ending the challenge with a red team victory. For their win, they got to taste wine with Chef Ramsay, while the blue team had to wash dishes for hours on end. Once again, however, the blue team did not take the punishment well, with Andrew complaining the entire time, Jessica being upset, and Ralph even throwing things at one point. Then the teams are instructed to create their own menus for the Battle of the Menus dinner service. While the red team is relatively coordinated and each member contributes an item to the menu, the blue team's menu is almost entirely designed by Ralph. When it's time for the menus to be presented to the customers, Jimmy presents a roasted duck breast, Michael presents a filet mignon, and Elsie presents a grilled paella. From the blue team, Ralph presents a mushroom agnolotti, a New York steak, a lemongrass poached halibut, and a flourless chocolate cake. Chef Ramsay announces that the menus are going head to head and the better menu will win. As an additional punishment for losing the reward challenge, Chef Ramsay locks the blue team's storage room, and every time they need to go back and forth to get items, they need to unlock it with the combination that he gives them. After they manage to unlock the door on the first try, Andrew grabs a roll of tape that Jessica tossed to him, trying to tape the door to his stand, but sous chef Scott catches him doing it and chews him out for it, saying, "You messed up, you pay the consequences," or something along those lines. And as a result, he puts the chickens back in the storage room and locks it again, having them put in the combination once again to unlock the door. Then dinner service begins. Jimmy tries to get the red team off to a quick start by quickly bringing scallops up to the pass, but they're undercooked. As a possible result, the blue team gets their food out much more quickly than the red team, making more progress, but then a hair is found in one of the agnolottis, and Chef Ramsay chews out Jessica for it. Jimmy brings the scallops back up to the pass, but this time, instead of being undercooked, they're overcooked, and Michael has to take over his station, and when he does, the scallops are much better. Andrew then produces a perfectly cooked halibut, but makes the mistake of putting it on cold plates. As the dinner service progresses, the blue team's menu is getting picked more often, but they also have more complaints, specifically about the halibut being overcooked. The red team's entrees that they came up with then start to head out, with the duck breast and filet mignon getting rave reviews, but the paella being not so great. Jimmy continues to have issues all night, this time with seasoning his food, and Ralph makes the mistake of waving at some customers during dinner service, with Chef Ramsay calling him out for it, and the kitchen shuts down once again. During the post-mortem, Chef Ramsay praises them for serving almost the entire dining room, but not quite. He also goes into some of the individual performances, first with Michael, and praising him for coming out of Chris's shadow, but also criticizing Jimmy because he could not get out of the starting blocks. He also said Jessica's performance was decent, and also called out Ralph for being distracted during service. The results of the menu are revealed, with the red team's menu being chosen by 42 diners, and the blue team's chosen by 53. But the blue team lost because their most popular item was sent back 6 times, that being the halibut. Andrew tries to explain how the dish would have worked, and also called out Ralph because he said it was Ralph's team, but Ralph tried to imply that it was a team effort. And then Chef Ramsay asked Jessica to nominate one person from the blue team for elimination. Back in the dorms, Andrew continued complaining about Ralph's menu idea, which absolutely sunk the kitchen in his eyes, and he said in a confessional that he should have opened his mouth but didn't, and stood there like a sissy. Despite being on a different team, Michael tried to push Jessica to get Ralph eliminated, seeing him as his biggest competition, but Jessica tells Ralph privately that she won't be doing so. And she follows through with this, nominating Andrew because she thinks he has something missing. And Chef Ramsay does call him forward, but also calls Ralph forward because he wants to hear from him as well. During their pleas, they both said that the other person was responsible for the messed up halibut, with Chef Ramsay further questioning Andrew on the matter before eliminating him. And he even threw shade at him in his finishing statement as well, saying that he discovered a fake and that Andrew can't cook. This was definitely one of the better episodes of season 1 because there was quite a bit going on. We saw the first outburst from sous chef Scott, and we saw Andrew finally get eliminated. Speaking of Andrew, let's talk about him. And he was definitely one of the bigger characters of the season. I'd argue either the biggest or second biggest character of the season, but as a cook, he was not good. He could not deliver when it mattered. Every service for Andrew, something went wrong, whether it be cooking related or whether he just couldn't communicate. Andrew was not one of the stronger chefs, and I think the only reason he made it as far as he did, as many people have also noted, is due to the fact that he made for good TV. If he would have gotten a black jacket, he definitely would have been one of the worst black jackets ever, but he didn't, so whatever. Even so, he is an insane character from this season. Up next, we have episode 7, day 7, which is a fine episode. It's not as interesting as some of the others, though it did give us some angry Ramsay moments for the first time, as in truly angry Ramsay. The episode starts off with Jessica, because of course it does, that's a pattern for the previous few episodes, where she talks about her decision to not nominate Ralph, despite knowing that Ralph is her biggest competition. She says that Ralph still deserves to be here, And the sentiment that Ralph is competition is shared by Michael, who says that Ralph is his number one competition. We then cut to Elsie, who seems to be a little checked out of the competition for some reason. The next day, the final five are called down to the kitchen, where he crowns them Black Jackets and announces that they are no longer two teams, but only one. After putting on their jackets and going back down to the kitchen again, it's time for the reward challenge, where the chefs have to make a flambe. They all have 5 minutes to get their ingredients and bring them back to their station before flambeing the ingredients. Initially, Jessica and Elsie forget their carts, and Jessica also burns her sugar, with Jimmy also struggling because he makes a mess. Once the 5 minutes are up, each of the dishes is judged individually, starting with Michael, who has nice caramel but dirty plating, kind of like Jimmy used to have. Then there's Ralph, whose dish was judged to be good, but he also forgot to dust the fruit in the sugar. Jessica also has problems with the sugar, as the sugar is raw. But then we cut to Elsie, whose plate is clean and has nice caramel, and the same with Jimmy, who also has a nice flambe, with it ultimately coming down to Elsie and Jimmy, with Jimmy being crowned the winner. As a reward, he gets a trip out of Hell's Kitchen with Chef Ramsay, including a helicopter tour of Los Angeles. He also gets to pick someone to bring with him, and surprisingly, he chooses Michael, which strategically didn't really make a lot of sense. You ideally want to pick the person who came in second, but from a personal perspective, I can understand why Jimmy did this, as he felt he probably owed Michael, with it being in relation to Michael nominating Chris instead of Jimmy on day 5. As a punishment, Ralph, Jessica, and Elsie have to clean the dining room, with the women seeming annoyed at Jimmy choosing Michael as opposed to Elsie, with even Ralph agreeing that he should have done that. Jimmy and Michael are treated to wine by JP in Los Angeles, while Elsie continues to complain about not being picked for the reward. She's still complaining by the time Jimmy and Michael get back, and Jimmy notices it, and he says that it has to do with competition, which I don't buy that. The dinner service that night is essentially the same as the previous one, just with a slightly spiced up menu. As an additional reward for winning the challenge, Jimmy gets to choose a chef to go on tableside that night, and he ends up choosing Elsie. After the chefs finish prepping, Chef Ramsay decides to give the sous chefs the night off, and as a result, the final 5 have to rely more on each other as opposed to the sous chefs. Then dinner service begins, with Ralph and Michael getting the kitchen off to a good start, and Elsie struggling somewhat in the dining room, though she does eventually get her act together. A lot of people in the dining room order the filet mignon, and as a result, Chef Ramsay has JP start selling fish as an alternative. While cooking, Jessica's pan catches fire and she has trouble putting it out. 45 minutes into dinner service, food is quickly being sent to the diners, but then the power goes out for a minute, although it is quickly restored. Then Jimmy once again begins to struggle as he has problems with communication and also throws out a lobster by mistake. In the dining room, Elsie is still having trouble, especially with the Caesar salad, as one customer wants it cut, so she cuts it. After an hour and a half, the kitchen is still putting out appetizers at a feverish pace, but then Jessica runs out of filet mignon and also shows a little bit of attitude, with Chef Ramsay being annoyed by this and also yells at her to get back on her section. Instead of Jessica getting the filet mignons, however, Michael does, and Chef Ramsay also accuses Jessica of giving up. Once Elsie finally finishes serving Caesar salad to the customer, she moves on to the flambés, but once again she struggles, with the customer noting that she probably hasn't prepared either that or a Caesar salad ever. Back in the kitchen, Jimmy continues to struggle with communication and also screws up dish after dish, even putting fish stock in a risotto, and after Chef Ramsay questions him on the matter, he finally snaps and essentially yells at Chef Ramsay, which again, big no-no. Despite Elsie finding her groove with the flambés and the customers really enjoying them, Jessica's pan catching on fire again is the final straw and the kitchen shuts down. After a previous comment from Chef Ramsay about how Ralph is a very safe individual to have in the kitchen, he once again names him the best of the worst and instructs him to nominate 2 chefs for elimination. Elsie tries to get Ralph to nominate her despite her being on tableside, as she's exhausted, and she tries to justify it to him, but Michael, who is nearby, doesn't seem to buy it. There's a sense of unease from everyone, especially Jessica, who knows that she screwed up that night. And then the chefs reconvene, with Ralph firstly nominating Jimmy due to making the team lose time through distractions and also for his altercation with Chef Ramsay. And he also nominated Jessica because she could not execute tables and plates, and also likely due to her pans catching fire. Once they come forward, Jimmy admits that his argument with Chef Ramsay was uncalled for, and Jessica says something somewhat similar, but also that she was disappointed with her performance performance. Initially, it seems as if Chef Ramsay is going to eliminate Jessica, but says that she fought back while Jimmy didn't, and as a result, Jimmy is the first Black Jacket to be eliminated. But not before Chef Ramsay praises him for getting as far as he did. However, in his final comment, he said that Jimmy couldn't handle the heat, which I'm not going to disagree on that. I do think Jimmy was the weakest chef out of the 5. And speaking of Jimmy, let's talk about him as a character. And as a character, Jimmy was a little bit of a character, but as a chef, he just wasn't the greatest and definitely should not have made the Black Jackets. There were so many opportunities for Jimmy to be eliminated from his team. For example, in Service 1, he was the weakest member of the red team that night because Caroline and Dewberry just had issues where they weren't really doing anything, while Jimmy was the one actively making the most mistakes. In episode 5, he should have been nominated, but Michael decided to pull a strategic move and save Jimmy. And the following service, he once again has a bevy of mishaps, and if the red team lost, he definitely goes home. So Jimmy was definitely lucky to make it as far as he did, and he is not a very good Black Jacket, I'm not gonna lie. And as a character, he's just kind of okay. Not offensive, not bad, but not a great character, so I feel like Jimmy was okay on this season. He did have that yelling match with Chef Ramsay in his boot episode, but I feel like that's the highlight of him being a character. Up next, we have episode 8, Day 8, and this episode is just so ugly. This episode sucks, quite frankly. It's really hard to watch, but I sat through it and I'm going to go over it anyway. So we start off once again with Jessica talking about the elimination, and she was disappointed to be nominated, but also admitted that she should have been. And then we get a confession from Michael, who says he creates friendships, but they don't mean more to him than winning a restaurant. For the reward challenge, the chefs are given a series of leftovers and have to create a dish with it, with Michael trying to get chicken on his dish but running out of time, and Jessica also running out of time and getting called up by sous chef Scott. Once they present their dishes, Jessica presents a beef stew and a berries and cream dessert with a sloppy presentation but tasting quite nice. Then Michael made pasta and chicken wings, with the pasta looking nice but also tasting pretty bad, and he also forgot to take the bones out of the chicken. Ralph also made a chicken meal, making chicken drumsticks, which looked nice and didn't taste that bad, but also had a lack of ingredients and raw onions. Finally, Elsie made a simple chicken soup, which, although color-wise looked a mess, Chef Ramsay said it was delicious, with it ultimately coming down to Jessica and Elsie, and the latter being declared the winner of the challenge. For her reward, she gets a limo ride to a television studio with the opportunity to cook on national television, whereas the others are punished by cleaning the dining room and the kitchen. Ralph finally snaps from all the punishment he's had to do, and also gets upset over not getting to venture outside of Hell's Kitchen, because the one reward he did win was a spa day in the dorms. As Michael, Ralph, and Jessica clean the kitchen, sous chef Scott stops them to watch Elsie's appearance on TV, and this is where the episode really takes a downturn, as the three are very bitter over Elsie's appearance. As a result of this, Michael, Ralph, and Jessica decide to make a plan to essentially sabotage Elsie so that she's the next one to go. While one could argue this was possibly strategy, this seemed a lot more personal and just really ugly to watch, in my opinion. And then when Elsie gets back, she has the opportunity to decide who is on what station, but has time to think about it. Once Elsie decides, she puts Jessica on appetizers, Michael on garnish, herself on fish, and Ralph on meat. As dinner service begins, there are already issues, with Jessica struggling to communicate and trying to redeem herself but failing, with her salad coming out disgusting. So Michael and Ralph have to jump in and help Jessica get her appetizers out. After trying and failing to get the chefs more motivated to complete service, Chef Ramsay switches the stations, putting Michael on appetizers, Jessica on meat, Ralph on fish, and Elsie on garnish. And really, it just screwed over Elsie because she struggles to adapt to the garnish station after being on the fish station. Despite trying, she fails, to the point where Michael takes the leadership role once again. After further issues, Chef Ramsay once again switches the stations, putting Jessica on fish, Ralph on garnish, Elsie on appetizers, and Michael on meat. Elsie, however, isn't the only one to struggle that night, as Jessica continues to struggle, especially with the lobster, with one of her lobster risottos getting compared to a dog's dinner, but not just any dog's dinner, specifically Dewberry's dog's dinner. Unfortunately, the plan to sabotage Elsie continues to work as Elsie tries to communicate with Ralph Ralph, but Ralph intentionally doesn't communicate back, and Chef Ramsay takes it out on Elsie. He even pulls Elsie off to the side to try to figure out where she is in the game, and has her take a moment but doesn't kick her out of the kitchen. And as a direct result of all this torment, Elsie melts down because no one said a word to her all night. As everyone continues to struggle, especially the women, dinner service grinds to a halt, and a piece of wood is found in a customer's dish, seeming to originate from one of the lobster risottos, leading to customers walking out once again and the kitchen once again shutting down, for what seems to be the 5th or 6th time this season. In the post-mortem, Chef Ramsay is so upset that he decides no one will be nominating anyone for elimination that night and that he will be doing it himself. While Elsie knows that she did the worst that night, she also partially blames the others for not communicating with her, seeming to know it was a part of the sabotage. When the final 4 reconvene in the dining room, Chef Ramsay calls the women forward. Jessica said that she pulled it together and could get stronger despite the competition getting tougher, and Elsie admits that she was disoriented in the kitchen and also not prepared for that night, despite not admitting the communication issues were caused by the others intentionally not communicating. As a result, in a decision that I think was a little bit questionable, Chef Ramsay decided to eliminate Elsie, but also praised her for impressing him despite having little experience. And yeah, this episode sucked to watch. The entire sabotage didn't seem strategic, it seemed almost entirely personal, because they were salty Elsie got to appear on national TV and they didn't. This, in my opinion, is the worst episode of the season. It just sucked. So now let's finally talk about Elsie, who maybe wasn't the most riveting TV in the world, but come on, it's hard to root against her. For someone with no kitchen experience, Elsie's run on Hell's Kitchen was actually pretty impressive, and she started off really strong. Her performances did start to decline in the latter half of the season, but I still think Elsie was one of the better chefs of the season, and she is one of my favorite chefs from a personal standpoint due to her underdog story, at least from this season, that is. I'd even argue that Elsie actually got screwed in her boot round, because in addition to everyone being so bitter over her victory to the point where they came up with that plan to sabotage her, Chef Ramsay had everyone switch stations, not once but twice, and the first time was when Elsie started to break down, while the second one made things even worse, because Elsie wasn't shown to be making any mistakes on the fish station that she put herself on, and it was shown that Jessica was the one having those mistakes, and I think that Elsie was a stronger chef than Jessica up to that point, and if Chef Ramsay didn't switch stations, then Jessica would have been eliminated, not just for her declining performances, but also the issues she had with communication that night. So really, Elsie got screwed in this situation. I don't think she would have made the final, but she would have at least gotten 3rd place if this had not happened. Up next, we have episode 9, an episode that I found to be largely flat. It begins with a celebration with the final 3, although Jessica does get drunk, which was probably one of the more interesting moments of the entire episode. After Ralph and Jessica hit the sack, Michael stays up later, but then gets to answer the phone from Chef Ramsay, who wants the final 3 to put on their chef jackets and meet him in the kitchen, despite it being 4 a.m. The reason? Because he wants them to bake some bread, as the baker is unavailable. Michael and Ralph take the reins in making the bread because Jessica is a little drunk, and after getting a little bit of sleep, she rejoins them. They finish making the bread at about 8 a.m. and are finally able to get some sleep for about 2 hours. Then Chef Ramsay has them come back into the kitchen and teaches them how to make a souffle before giving them 10 minutes to make a souffle of their own. Each of them puts chocolate into their souffle with varying ingredients, with Jessica using mint, Ralph using mint and hazelnut, and Michael using raspberries. After 10 minutes, their souffles are put in the oven and baked, and then are presented and judged as such. When Jessica's is baked, it comes out spongy and isn't really that good. When Ralph's souffle comes out, the flavors work well, but the souffle itself needed more egg whites, and Michael's, when baked, needed more sugar, ultimately giving the win to Ralph. But Ralph doesn't really win anything except the first choice of which protein he wants to work with for his dish. He chooses beef, and Michael goes second, choosing tuna, leaving Jessica with chicken. Then they have to come up with their dishes based on ingredients they have in the kitchen, and also the proteins they were given. Michael creates a sesame crusted tuna with roasted vegetables and a lobster riced pilaf. Ralph goes with a simple filet mignon, and Jessica is unsure initially, but eventually decides to stuff her chicken with goat cheese and herbs and wrap it in prosciutto. As they prep, Chef Ramsay announces that the performances of the final 3 will be judged as usual, and he still wants them to complete a full dinner service, but the customers' opinions will also factor into his decision. And unknown to the chefs, there are VIP guests which happen to be their families, and they also have to work stations in addition to their main courses, with Michael being on apps, Ralph on garnish, and Jessica on dessert. desserts. Within the first hour of dinner service, Jessica does need extra time on her chicken, but other than that, there aren't that many issues and the main courses begin to go out to the diners. While the filet mignon and chicken are well received by the diners, the tuna doesn't receive as much of a warm reception. Jessica continues to struggle in the kitchen as she had during the previous Black Jacket services with communication, in part due to her having to deal with desserts and the chicken course as well, and as a result, Michael and Ralph have to bail Jessica out once again. The courses get to one of the VIP stations, who find the filet mignon and tuna okay, but doesn't really like the chicken. Jessica begins to get in the weeds with her desserts and even breaks a plate by mistake, and begins to lose her cool after messing up some souffles and commits the cardinal sin of asking Chef Ramsay to help her, with it even being noted by the narrator. Even JP has to help Jessica with the dessert and has to appease the VIP tables due to this delay. Despite all these issues, the final three reach the last ticket and are able to get it out without any problems. During the post-mortem, the results are revealed, with Ralph's filet mignon being the most ordered dish at 42 orders, Jessica's chicken coming in second with 34 orders, and Michael's tuna being in last with 26 orders. But they did manage to complete a fully booked dining room, with Chef Ramsay saying that he was a very proud man, and that no dishes were sent back into the kitchen. However, one of them would still be eliminated that night, and Michael seemed to be the most uneasy because his tuna was the least ordered item. When they reconvene, Chef Ramsay once again praises the final three and lets the chefs meet their families before he announces his decision. Chef Ramsay also announced that the final three's families were tasked with deciding which of the final three had the best dish, and that their comment cards would determine the two finalists and who would be the final person eliminated. Ralph's family went first, with all three of his family members liking the tuna the most, netting Michael 3 points. For Jessica's family, it was split down the board, with her girlfriend liking the tuna, her sister liking the chicken, and her mother liking the filet mignon, netting each of the final three 1 point. Finally, it came down to Michael's family, and his wife and father-in-law liked the filet mignon the most, while his mother-in-law liked the tuna the most, getting Ralph 2 more points and Michael 1 more point, making the final score 5 points for Michael, 3 points for Ralph, and 1 point for Jessica, making Jessica the final person eliminated and Ralph and Michael the finalists. It was kind of an obvious outcome in my eyes, as Ralph and Michael were far and away stronger than Jessica, and even if there wasn't a challenge like this, I still think Jessica would have been the final boot of the season. So now let's talk about Jessica, who I know is not well liked in the HK community, and I'll admit, Jessica's not one of my favorites, but I don't dislike her as much as some people do. I do think she was pretty overexposed in the season, especially with the beginning of each episode kind of revolving around Jessica's thoughts to an extent. I didn't really need to see that much. Jessica was one of the better chefs of the season, but I don't think she was top tier per se. I thought she was just fine. She also wasn't that huge of a character on the season, so while I don't hate Jessica by any means, and I actually think I like her more than most people do, she's still not one of my favorites, and she's just in my opinion when it comes to this season, both in terms of talent and her personality. And that brings us to the finale of the season, Day 10, which was a finale that I thought was kind of dull. And this mainly has to do with the fact that the pacing of the episode is just so slow. After beginning the episode with a recap, we resume from where we left off on Day 9, with Michael and Ralph finally getting to spend some time with their families, even though it is a little brief. The next morning, they each converse about their journey in Hell's Kitchen, with Ralph saying that he feels like $1 million. Then Chef Ramsay meets with them to discuss their performances in Hell's Kitchen and giving them suggestions for the final. He wants Michael to quote-unquote unleash the beast, and Ralph to slow down a little bit. Then a divider comes down, as the two of them will be designing their own restaurants. They are tasked with designing the restaurants as well as their own menus, and also leading the kitchens, and will have the support of a designer, JP, and the sous chefs. First, they design the restaurant itself, then meet with JP to come up with attire for the waitstaff, and then finally begin construction on their restaurants. And this is what I mean when I said this episode is kind of dull and slow, because a majority of the first half of the episode is focused almost entirely on the restaurant construction. We do see a little bit of Ralph and Michael working on their menus for the restaurants, restaurants, but it mostly has to do with the construction of the restaurants itself. There are a couple of problems that they run into during the construction, but it doesn't really add to the episode as a whole. After a while, we finally break from the construction process, with Chef Ramsay asking Michael and Ralph to produce signature dishes for him. These are not to be confused with the signature dish challenge in the beginning of the season, but these are different signature dishes. Ralph comes up with a porterhouse steak, while Michael comes up with a braised short ribs ossobuco. But Chef Ramsay isn't the one tasting them, he has them come with him to the streets and have customers taste them. In the final challenge, after having a total of 18 people try both dishes, Michael handily defeats Ralph 12-6. Then we get back into the construction, where there are still some problems, but for the most part it's kind of the same thing. Then we get something of intrigue, with Chef Ramsay having Michael and Ralph perform at the hot plate, and this is where we get the infamous moment where Michael says, "You guys cook like old people F," which makes Chef Ramsay laugh, and also noted that it was the catalyst for Michael to find his groove of sorts. Then when Ralph took a turn at the pass, Chef Ramsay noted that he took the challenge head on and excelled, but Michael intentionally sabotaged Ralph by not putting crab in the risotto, not just doing it one time, but multiple times throughout the test. And Ralph also annoyed JP by calling him Jean-Pierre instead of Jean-Philippe. The crab risottos then begin to make their way back up to the hot plate for not having crab in them, with Chef Ramsay explaining that Ralph's main weakness has been exposed, with it being that he doesn't taste the dishes before sending them out. Ralph tries to ask Michael about the whole issue, but Chef Ramsay is more annoyed with Ralph because it should have been his duty to call it out in the first place, and Chef Ramsay explained that Michael had him look stupid. Once the test comes to an end, Chef Ramsay explains their weaknesses. Michael's is that he needs to run his staff and not let his staff run him, while Ralph's quality control standards need to improve. Michael decides to take this to heart and begins to practice being more assertive, much to Ralph's enjoyment. Then we get more construction of the restaurants, because of course we need that in this episode. There are some problems that arise, but again, this is not interesting at all. Gordon Ramsay once again has Michael and Ralph meet in the kitchen, where Chef Ramsay introduces them to their staff, bringing in the former contestants that were eliminated before them. All of the final 8, minus Chris and Mary Ellen, who were unable to return, and in their places were Wendy and Dewberry. Because Michael won the challenge, he got first pick and he chose Jessica. Ralph countered this by picking Andrew. Then, with their second picks, Michael took Jimmy and Ralph took Wendy, leaving Michael with his last pick being either Elsie or Dewberry, and he decided to go with Elsie, leaving Ralph with Dewberry. The two then discussed their plans with brigades before prepping for service, and Andrew accidentally sliced his finger during prep and he had to go to the hospital for it, and he seemed pretty disheartened in his confessional because he thought he wasn't going to come back. Ultimately, Ralph decides to pitch a plan to Chef Ramsay to work Andrew's stations for him until he can come back, and he showed his restaurant to Chef Ramsay because the restaurant thing is a big deal in this episode, but Chef Ramsay describes it as warm, beautiful, and lovely, and met with his staff before doing the same with Michael's restaurant. Luckily for Ralph, Andrew arrives just before dinner service can begin and immediately gets back into prep, and then the final dinner service gets underway. After Michael calls out his first ticket, his brigade begins to have problems because they don't respond to him, and Michael does begin to get a little flustered, but appetizers soon fly out at a rapid rate to rave reviews. Ralph tries to organize his team as opposed to being on the hot plate, which does not go unnoticed by Chef Ramsay, and Ralph has his waiters tie the customers over with antipasta due to the delays. When a customer finds plastic in one of Michael's dishes, he shows it to Elsie and chews her out for it, and Elsie kind of sinks a little further by getting into an argument with Jessica. Tensions continue to boil over in Michael's kitchen as the three chefs struggle to work together, while Ralph's kitchen begins to rally. Dewberry begins to have problems of his own by accidentally putting fish stock into the pasta, and also begins to feel faint due to how hot it was in the kitchen. Soon enough, JP goes to Ralph, noting how the food is great, but it's really slow to get out. Dewberry has to go to the back room and recuperate because of how hot it is and how faint he feels, with Ralph attempting to keep it together as Andrew and Wendy tend to Dewberry before going back to their own stations. After a few minutes of recovering and seeming to learn his lesson from episode 2, Dewberry makes his way back into the kitchen and brings up a bass that he says is made with love. Ralph praises Dewberry for his comeback, referring to him as the Rock of Gibraltar and the Hope Diamond, but Dewberry says that he would rather Ralph be saying he was Brad Pitt's wife wife, which makes not only Chef Ramsay laugh, but even sous chef Scott laugh, despite Ralph saying that Dewberry had issues. A piece of food returns to Michael's kitchen because there was a piece of meat that was undercooked, but it gets refired, with Michael continuing to get more assertive as the service continued. Utilizing Chef Ramsay's teaching style, the two of them managed to get their last entrees out before moving on to desserts, with the dinner service concluding without any other major hiccups. During the post-mortem, Chef Ramsay announces that his decision will be based off the customer comment cards, and then Michael and Ralph say goodbye to their brigades before retiring to the dorms to await the decision. Once the decision is made, the sous chefs go to Michael and Ralph and blindfold them, and then lead them to the set of doors that would later become infamous in Hell's Kitchen. Chef Ramsay gives the results of the customer comment cards, with the main question being if the customers would return to the restaurant. Both restaurants had return rates in the 90th percentile, but one of them had 90% on the dot, while the other one had 94%, giving them the advantage and likely the win. Michael and Ralph then faced the doors and put their hands on the handles, turning them, but only Michael's door opened, crowning him the winner of Hell's Kitchen Season 1. Ralph took his defeat with honor and saying that Michael deserved to win, with Michael saying that he was in control of his own future as soon as he won. Chef Ramsay made Michael a further offer by inviting him to London to work in one of his restaurants, which, after a lot of thought, Michael accepted, though he later did decline it to stay home with his family. And then the season ends with Ramsay summarizing the performances of both the brigades and saying, "I'm effing out of here." While the dinner service was relatively fine, I found myself mostly uninterested over the course of the episode because there was too much of an emphasis on the restaurant construction and not enough focus on the dinner service itself and the events leading up to it. To close out this video, I'm going to give my thoughts on the final two, starting with Ralph, who was kind of a character and definitely one of the better chefs of the season. He definitely deserved to get to the final two. Though I will say there were a couple of moments from Ralph that I really didn't like, especially during the menu challenge, where the menu was entirely his doing, let's not kid about that. And a lot of people were upset with him because he essentially screwed over Andrew and even thought that he deserved to get eliminated in that episode, which I don't entirely agree with because Ralph did make a couple of mistakes, but nowhere near as many mistakes as Andrew did in that service, with Andrew also being the all-around weaker chef up to that point. That being said though, it was a little obvious that Ralph was getting to the end considering how much of a front runner he was and how much he was praised on the show, so I was expecting him to end up in the final two. Maybe not win the season, but definitely expected him to get as far as he did. And then there's Michael Ray, arguably the biggest character of the season, maybe behind Andrew, and definitely one of the most talented chefs of the season. Not to mention probably the most strategic chef in Hell's Kitchen history, with his nomination of Chris at the final 7, him sabotaging Ralph during the past performance test at the finals, and plenty of other strategic moments that he had that essentially made him stand out from all the rest. And I think this is part of the reason why he ended up winning at the end. It wasn't just his cooking or leadership, it was his strategy that we really haven't seen much of in seasons since. The main reason for that being because Hell's Kitchen has become more about chef talent and cooking and leadership as opposed to actual strategy. Now, Michael was a little bit quiet in the beginning and not as good, I'll admit, but once Chris got eliminated and even the moments leading up to it, Michael was beginning to stand out a lot more, and after he got rid of his biggest competition, he really shined on the red team, with him being constantly praised by Chef Ramsay for his skills. And this carried over into the Black Jackets. For example, during the Final Four service, Chef Ramsay noted that Michael did a lot of good things that night, but they just weren't enough. So I do think he is one of the best chefs from the season, possibly the best, and definitely a deserving winner in my eyes. And also a great character too, that always helps. But that'll conclude my review of Hell's Kitchen Season 1, which, again, I thought was okay. There were a couple of episodes that I liked, such as Episode 3, but also some episodes that really sucked, like Episode 4 because it was just kind of boring, and even the last 3 episodes of the season, with the latter 2 being boring and Episode 8 just sucking in general. But it's not the worst Hell's Kitchen season in the world. There are other seasons that suck a lot more that I'll get into later, though there were definitely growing pains for Hell's Kitchen as shown by the season. It would get better from here, but this was just an okay start. So that'll do it for this review. My name's Owen, and I'll catch you guys next time in the front yard. Take care.